He had the biggest sitcom on American television. 4 Emmys, a Golden Globe, a paycheck that made him the highest-paid actor on TV for 4 years straight. So why did Jim Parsons just admit, at 53 years old, that he was miserable through most of it? Not sad for a season. Not stressed for an episode. Miserable during what everyone else assumed were the best years of his life. He says he wouldn't live that way again for any amount of money. But the real story isn't the sitcom. It's what was happening underneath it the whole time, and it started long before Sheldon Cooper ever existed. A confession he waited 13 years to make. In July of 2026, Jim sat down for a podcast interview and said something he had never said this plainly before. He looked back at some of the best moments of his career and realized he had been unhappy in them. Not nervous. Not tired. Unhappy. He described feeling like he had dozens of plates spinning in the air at once, and believing that if even one dropped, everything he had built would fall apart with it. From the outside, people called it discipline. Work ethic. The mark of a serious actor. Jim now calls it something closer to obsession, a compulsive need to control every outcome because he didn't trust that good things could simply happen to him. The interview itself was notable for another reason too. The host, also openly gay, spent much of the conversation with Jim comparing notes on what it costs to build a public career while hiding a private self, and Jim didn't dodge any of it. He admitted that even after 12 seasons and hundreds of episodes, he never stopped feeling like the most nervous person on set, still terrified before every single take that he'd forget his lines, a fear that never once matched the calm, buttoned-up professional image people saw on screen. He said the pattern cost him years of his actual life, moments with people he loved that he simply wasn't present for because his mind was somewhere else, calculating the next risk. This wasn't a passing comment. He's brought it up more than once this year, each time with more detail than the last. Which raises an obvious question. What happens to a person's mind when they spend 12 years terrified of losing something, even while the whole world tells them they've already won? To understand where that fear came from, you have to go back to 2001, years before Sheldon Cooper existed, to the day Jim's entire relationship with time changed forever. 6 years was the number he couldn't ignore. On April 29, 2001, Jim's father, Milton Parsons, died in a car accident. He was 52 years old. Jim was 28, still years away from booking Big Bang Theory, still auditioning for parts he wouldn't get. His father had run a plumbing company back in Houston and had veered off the road alone, later found by a passing driver. Jim wouldn't book his breakout role for another 6 years after that, which means his father never got to see any of it, not the Emmys, not the Golden Globe, not a single second of the show that would make his son a household name. Years later, on the television special Hollywood Medium, Jim revisited the loss on camera and was told something that seemed to genuinely settle him, that no faster medical response that day could have changed the outcome. Whatever comfort that gave him, it didn't erase the math he'd started doing in his head. That math became impossible to ignore in 2018, when Big Bang Theory was still one of the most watched shows on the planet. Jim was 46. He realized that was exactly 6 years younger than his father had been when he died. So he asked himself a question most people spend their whole lives avoiding. If someone told him he had 6 years left, would he spend another season playing Sheldon Cooper? His answer was no. Not because he'd stopped loving the role. Because he needed to find out what else was out there before his own 6 years ran out. He took that reasoning straight to the show's producers, Chuck Lorre and Steve Molaro, before he ever discussed it with the people he'd spent 12 years standing next to on camera. His own castmates didn't see it coming. Kaylee Cuoco has said she was so shaken by the news she could barely breathe. Johnny Galecki has said he felt blindsided, not by the decision itself, but by finding out without warning, and has since admitted the whole thing could have been handled with more care. Jim's father never got a say in how his story ended. Jim made sure he would. But walking away from Big Bang Theory didn't close the chapter on loss in his life. 6 years later, on a completely different set, grief would find him again, in a way almost too strange to believe. A death on a Hulu set that echoed his own words. In 2025, Jim joined the Hulu comedy Mid-Century Modern, alongside Nathan Lane, Matt Bomer, and the legendary Linda Lavin. The show itself was loosely inspired by the Golden Girls, following 3 gay friends who move in together in Palm Springs, with Lavin playing the sharp-tongued mother of Nathan Lane's character. By every account on set, she was adored by literally everyone, cast and crew alike, described by the show's own creators as universally loved in a way that felt personal rather than professional. Then, on December 29, 2024, with only 3 episodes left to film, Lavin died suddenly at 87, following a fast-moving lung cancer diagnosis nobody had time to process. The show's creators faced an impossible decision: recast her, quietly write her off, or confront it directly. Before she passed, Lavin herself had apparently made her wishes clear, telling the writers not to shy away from the truth if anything happened to her. They chose to write her real death into the fictional story, and what they used still gives people chills. In her final moments, being driven to the hospital by her husband, Lavin had grabbed his hand and told him she loved him, in case this was it. The writers put that exact moment into the show, almost word for word, spoken by her character to her television son in an episode the creators later called terrifying to write. Hulu gave the cast and crew an extra week off before they returned to film it. Jim was there filming alongside Matt Bomer just weeks after Lavin's actual death, acting out grief that wasn't fictional at all. He was mourning a real friend while performing a scripted version of her final scene, on a schedule that gave the cast barely any time to process what had happened before the cameras rolled again. It's the kind of moment that doesn't show up in a highlight reel or an award acceptance speech, but it stayed with him. And it wasn't the first time Jim had to keep working while grieving something enormous. Years earlier, during his very last stretch on Big Bang Theory, loss found him in a way that almost broke him completely. A dog, an injury, and a cliff he says he saw. The final season of Big Bang Theory should have been a celebration. Instead, it became one of the hardest stretches of Jim's life. As filming wound down, one of his dogs was nearing the end of his life, and Jim and his husband, Todd, made the agonizing decision to let him go at home rather than risk him dying alone at a vet's office while Jim was at work. Just days later, while the rest of the world was gearing up for months of farewell specials and cast tributes celebrating the end of a beloved show, Jim injured himself on stage. He's since described that period as the scariest few days of his life, saying it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down into something genuinely dark. This was happening while millions of viewers were tuning in every week to laugh at Sheldon Cooper's quirks, with absolutely no idea what the actor behind him was carrying. It's worth remembering, too, that this wasn't a one-time lapse in confidence for Jim. Even years into playing the same character, and even later on Broadway stages performing in front of live audiences, he has said the fear of blanking on his lines never fully went away, making him, by his own admission, the most nervous person in almost any room he worked in. It's a strange kind of loneliness, being watched by an audience of millions while going through something you can't explain to any of them. Now, this wasn't the first time Jim had learned to hide pain behind a performance. Long before Hollywood knew his name, he'd already spent years mastering exactly that skill, for a completely different reason. The closet he built before anyone in Hollywood knew his name. Growing up in a Houston suburb, the son of a plumbing company president and a schoolteacher, Jim performed in school plays from first grade all the way through 12th, a passion that never really left him even when he tried to abandon it. At one point, convinced acting was too impractical a career to chase, he actually quit for a year, planning instead to go back and finish a business degree like a sensible person would. It was watching his actor friends rehearse, and encouragement from Todd Spiewak, then his boyfriend, that pulled him back in. The two of them eventually moved to Los Angeles together so Jim could pursue acting seriously, and he went on to earn a master's degree in classical theater at the University of San Diego. But underneath all of that ambition was a fear that had nothing to do with career risk. Jim spent years terrified of being discovered as gay. That fear didn't fade when he became an adult, and it didn't fade when he moved to New York City to chase an acting career. He has said that even the sight of a pride parade used to frighten him, because he knew people around him held hateful opinions about exactly who he was. So he avoided gay-friendly neighborhoods entirely, just to stay invisible, choosing to blend into ordinary city blocks rather than risk being noticed for who he actually loved. He and Todd were together for roughly 10 years before Jim came out publicly, just days after a Big Bang Theory season finale aired. He said meeting Todd was the real reason he finally had that conversation with his family, because Todd mattered too much to keep hidden. Jim was terrified the announcement would hurt his career, maybe even cost him the show, at a time when leading men on major network sitcoms rarely came out publicly at all, especially ones playing characters beloved by a broad, mainstream, and not always progressive audience. Instead, the opposite happened. He said becoming part of a community that still faces open hostility gave him a strength he never expected, and if anything, it helped his career rather than hurting it. Long before that, though, the couple had already been quietly honored for who they were, invited to a respected awards ceremony in California that celebrated them as an inspirational gay couple, years before marriage was even legally possible for them everywhere in the country. Jim has said he never fully understood being framed that way, insisting he never viewed his relationship with Todd as any kind of statement or activism, just an ordinary life built on ordinary love. He and Todd married in 2017, after roughly 15 years together, and Jim has described their day-to-day life since as almost deliberately unremarkable, full of the same routines as anyone else's marriage. But even after building an entire life with the person he loves, and even after finally being honest with the world about who he is, Jim still couldn't outrun the thing that had shaped him since he was 28 years old. The role money could never buy back. Every reflection Jim has given in 2026 keeps circling back to the same idea: time. He's openly stated there is no amount of money that could get him to return to the version of himself that existed during the Big Bang Theory's biggest years, the version constantly overworking, constantly bracing for failure. He's called it a self-tortured stretch of his life, valuable in hindsight, but not something he'd choose to repeat. That's a strange thing to hear from someone who reached the exact kind of success most actors never get close to. 4 Emmys, a Golden Globe, a Tony nomination years later for the play Mother Play, a run in our town. Years earlier, Broadway roles in The Normal Heart, Harvey, An Act of God, and The Boys in the Band, a play he later reprised on screen. What's easy to forget now is how close he came to never getting any of it. Before The Big Bang Theory, Jim auditioned for roughly 30 different roles, only to watch pilot after pilot get rejected by the network once he'd actually booked the part. He even auditioned around the same era for the American version of The Office, though it never worked out, and he since admitted he privately thought the whole premise sounded like a bad idea, a British import Americans surely wouldn't want, a prediction that turned out spectacularly wrong. When he finally read for Sheldon Cooper, he felt an immediate pull toward the character, strong enough that he skipped a party the night before his audition just to keep working on his lines. His first audition went so well that producer Chuck Lorre reportedly assumed it had to be a fluke, bringing Jim back for a second reading just to make sure the performance wasn't beginner's luck. It wasn't. Ironically, the man who played television's most famous fictional scientist actually failed science back in school himself, something he's chalked up to only wanting to study meteorology because of growing up in hurricane country, not because he cared about the actual science behind it. Years spent directing and executive producing Young Sheldon followed, a spin-off idea that started as a conversa. Years spent directing and executive producing Young Sheldon followed, a spin-off idea that started as a conversation about whether audiences might want to see how Sheldon Cooper became the person viewers had come to know. The series became a major success in its own right, extending Jim Parsons' connection to the character long after he had stepped away from appearing on screen. Yet even while helping guide the franchise behind the scenes, his public comments increasingly made it clear that he had no desire to return to living the life he had lived during the height of the Big Bang Theory. Looking back now, Jim doesn't describe those years as a mistake. He recognizes what they gave him: financial security, career opportunities beyond anything he had imagined, lifelong friendships, and a place in television history. But he also speaks about the hidden cost, the constant pressure, the fear of failure, the belief that every success could disappear if he relaxed for even a moment. Those are the memories that stand out most clearly to him now, even more than the awards or the record-breaking paychecks. His story challenges one of Hollywood's biggest assumptions, that reaching the top automatically brings happiness. By almost every traditional measure, Jim Parsons had everything an actor could want. He became one of the most recognizable faces on television, earned critical acclaim year after year, and helped create one of the most successful sitcoms ever made. Yet behind that extraordinary success was someone quietly struggling with anxiety, grief, perfectionism, and the feeling that he could never truly let his guard down. Over time, he has become more willing to talk openly about those experiences, not because he wants sympathy, but because he hopes people understand that success doesn't erase emotional struggles. It simply changes the way they look from the outside. His reflections in 2026 suggest that the greatest lesson he has learned isn't about acting at all. It's about recognizing the value of time, protecting mental well-being, and refusing to sacrifice the present for a future that may never arrive.